Hello, and welcome to Godot Community for Visual Art High School 3D. This session will cover some end of year topics. I'll discuss some end of year projects that I like to do, some post production practices, the things that we do at the end of the year to wrap up our experience. I also want to talk a little bit about reflection of what we've done throughout the year, considering both things that have been successful and areas of improvement. And I think that probably this year, more than any, we can really reflect on successes. Uh, some of you have been able to do really amazing and wonderful and creative and crafty things, considering your circumstances. And then also, even though I understand that looking ahead to next fall and a new school year may seem like the farthest thing from your mind, I think it's really important to start laying the foundation and planning for a new year when things are fresh in your mind, and and how to approach a new school year as a fresh start. So I wanted to start by discussing a couple of year-end projects that I've had success with and that I think the students have really enjoyed. And the first of these would be appropriate for a beginning, maybe a ceramics two, but for sure a ceramics one or even a sculpture one course. And these are PEEPs or kiln peephole plugs. So if you're unfamiliar, a PEEP or a PEEP plug is a functional object, and we're going to talk about the purpose in just a moment. But the reason that I like this assignment is because it's a low risk assignment that allows for flexibility with both time and complexity. So I think we've all found ourselves at the end of a school year where maybe you have enough time to do something, but you don't have enough time to do maybe a larger project. So this is a nice compact assignment. Maybe you have students who are finishing up or completing work at different rates. So it would allow students who have more time to work in more complexity and students who have less time to maybe do something a little bit simpler. I don't think that this necessarily needs to culminate into a summative grade. However, it does reinforce the Georgia Standards of Excellence, covering planning and ideation, form and function, correct construction, formal compositional elements, and lastly, something we haven't really talked about, dogs. Sorry about that. Planning for presentation, and we're going to talk about that a little bit differently than we might if we were talking about presentation for an art exhibit, but instead for function. If you are not aware, a PEEP plug or a peephole plug is a little object that is used to plug a peephole in a kiln. And old school electric kilns that are not computerized often had a system, and some of you probably are still working with those, so you might know what I'm talking about, where the cones that indicated when a kiln reached a certain temperature would be placed in a little device, and then they would stand straight up, and then as the kiln reached the desired temperature, the cone would melt. And when the cone was melted, you would know that the kiln had reached the appropriate temperature for whichever firing you were trying to do. So some cones are formulated to fire at a 6, some an 06. So obviously you wouldn't want to open the kiln lid in the midst of a firing to see, or you probably wouldn't even be able to see. It would be so bright orange in your face. But these PEEP plugs, if you set this device that was holding your cones close to one of these peepholes, you'd be able to remove the plug, see where the device is in the melting process, and then plug it back up to maintain that heat inside. Another way that PEEPs have been used or can be used is some potters may unplug gradually the peepholes to force cool or to speed up the cooling process of a fired kiln. Depending on what you are doing, it could also contribute to ventilation. So these are functional objects. So students are required to make the cone part, which is the part that will actually plug in to the hole, and they have to follow specific size and shape guidelines, because if they don't make these correctly, then they are not functional. In addition, what I call the finial, or the decorative part of the PEEP, they have to take into consideration weight and size. So if they make something, for example, the ice cream cone on the top right, that had to, of course, be hollow, because even though they're smaller objects, if they are not hollow and they're, you know, a little bit larger than, say, the chess piece, it'll pull the plug right out of the hole. So they really do have to consider the physics in the engineering of the form. I mentioned earlier presentation. Another part of this project that I like is it shifts students away from the audience that they are used to making work for. So typically our students are making work for themselves, maybe members of their family, and we know that, you know, Nana thinks that anything that their little darling grandchild touches is gold, and it's beautiful and it's precious. Well, this is not for Nana or mom or even or dad or even themselves. It's to become a part of the function of the studio. And so because of that, they need to think about how this work is going to be out on display, and the fact that I do have students, student work, you know, I have these little PEEPs that are in the kiln. Students see them all the time. So these works are out on display all of the time, even in their functional purpose. And lastly, I think, you know, especially for a ceramics one, the students are starting to get comfortable in the space. And this just is that studio stewardship that I talk about, and wanting them to be invested in the space and have that sense of ownership of the space and pride. So making something that, you know, we all know that, you know, our advanced students love telling the lower level classes, this is what this is for, and oh, I made this, and this is how it's used. So it really starts to feed into that ownership of that space. Another end of year project that I like to do is with, I would suggest this would be more appropriate probably for a ceramics 2, 3, or even 4 class. And that is kiln goddesses and kiln gods. And again, this may or may not, I think it's more complex than a PEEP, but it may or may not culminate in a summative grade, but it nevertheless, it is reinforcing the GSE, covering historical ceramics, planning, choice of themes, form and function, communicating meaning, construction, formal compositional elements, and then again, the planning for presentation. So if you're not familiar with kiln gods, what they are kiln gods, or a goddess is created by a potter to be placed near the kiln opening. And in ancient Chinese and Egyptian cultures, these were typically little statues thought to be safekeepers of whatever was inside the kiln. So during that time, artisans didn't really know what caused certain issues with pottery, anywhere from things exploding in the kiln to crazing, cracking, or pinholes, etc. So they would make these little statues to watch over the kilns to protect the ware from those imperfections. Western kiln gods and goddesses are most often displayed on the roof of the kiln, or just looking over the kiln or the kiln door, where they can watch over the firing. kiln goddesses and gods of China are generally positioned in their own dedicated temple or shrine located near the kiln. So there are some options for the display of these objects. You can even find where Homer wrote of the 5 demons who existed solely for the torment of potters. So there's a kind of fun backstory, and these demons, I won't butcher their Greek names, but they, stood for the Shatterer and the Smasher and the Destroyer. So, if you didn't keep these gods pleased, then what was in your kiln may suffer the consequences. So there is a little bit of history there. And then, students have some choice of theme for their own work. I consider this a legacy project because students are making something that they're leaving behind. So again, you have that sense of ownership and respect for the studio space and that stewardship. For this project, I have them, they have a lot of freedom. And again, as you can see, there's some examples here that are a little bit more complex, some that are a little bit simplified. So I feel like it can be successful at a variety of skill levels. And again, it can work with some flexibility of time. So it doesn't have to, you can play with the size, the amount of detail. One component that I do ask that my students include is that it's somehow their God has to relate to firing ceramics or kilns or pottery in some way. So, for instance, on the bottom left, you see a little figure that's supposed to be based on a phoenix. So, obviously, that idea of rising from the ashes. Next to that, you have a little figure that has little kiln posts for legs, and then these little pieces on the top are just shards. So it looks like there are these cracked and broken shards. And then if you could see around back, you would see that there was a brick pattern to emulate kiln brick. A dragon obviously is associated with fire. So you can see that students are approaching this this theme or this connection with ceramics and pottery and firing in different ways. And then you have at the top the anglerfish, and at the end of its little line is a little cup, a little ceramic cup, which is the lure. So students can really get into this project. And again, it's something that they are leaving behind to look over the kilns and the kiln room in their absence. I'd like to shift now to talk about post-production practices. And again, I think that we have a hard time thinking about anything but getting out of there at the end of the year and leaving the space, hopefully in a somewhat organized place or space. But I want to talk about first documenting work. I think it's really important that as part of future planning and as just growing a portfolio of examples, that we don't let student exemplars walk out the door without documenting them. I personally do this throughout the year. I try to capture images in a range of successes. So obviously you want to have those exemplars that are showing the students this is what you want to achieve, but also it's good to capture those that are maybe middle of the road or those that are more emerging. And again, that goes back to when I talked about doing some of that diagnostic assessment and having students look at work and have them determine what is most and least successful so you can get an understanding of where they are in the understanding of the criteria of projects. Another thing is you want to make sure that you are storing tools and materials in a way that are safe from injury or theft or damage. Don't put your potter's wheels outside. I mean, obviously, some of you may need to, but at least make sure they're covered. Especially, some of us have really struggled to build up our supply of maybe more pricey tools. So we really want to safeguard those so we can continue to offer experiences to our students. So make sure that you are familiar with what tools can withstand elements. If you're lucky enough to have clay left over, you want to make sure that that is wrapped up. Clay will last a long time if it is wrapped up in a nice thick clay bag. But also you want to make sure that if people are going to be moving around your room, we always have to have everything off the tables and onto counters or in cabinets because they come in and they clean our floors. So I don't want to have a power tool or something else out where someone can injure themselves because I didn't move and store it properly. But just, we want to make sure that we're safeguarding these things that make our jobs from day to day a little bit more comprehensive, I guess, or at least allow the students a little bit more of a comprehensive experience because they have access to tools and materials. So just think about how you are storing them for the benefit of both yourself and your students. And then classroom reorganization. Think about what worked. I think in this year, obviously my classroom setup was completely different this year than it has been in prior years, just because I had to keep myself separated from my students physically because of social distancing. But also, I had to make sure that I was in front of a camera for those students who were remote. So, I'm already considering next year, how do I reorganize my classroom? It's uncertain in my district if we're going to continue to social distance or not. So, do I get rid of some of those desks that I had brought in and bring my wheels back, or full force, or what is that going to look like? And for some of us, we may need to wait until we have more word on what our classrooms are going to look like. But think about those constants: access to materials. Were your students able to access what they needed on a daily basis without taking a bunch of class time to go get this or go get that? So what are some things that you can maybe consider doing to streamline your process? And I personally am guilty of not always creating a streamlined experience. I think sometimes that comes from my own sometimes lack of organization. But also, if you're like me and you are moving from one prep to another, so maybe you're going from sculpture to ceramics to intro back to ceramics, you have to sort of allow for all of these different tools and materials for these different classes. If you've ever had to teach a 2D class right behind a ceramics class, what a pain trying to get the tables cleaned off so that they're good for paper or whatnot. So what are some things that you can do moving forward that maybe would make that transition a little less stressful? I think reflection is something that is also great to be done throughout the year. I personally keep a journal and a folder, And to look at it would be kind of laughable because it looks like a bunch of just scrap pieces of paper shoved in. Sometimes it's just a post-it note. I do write down notes. I try to, I make marks through rubrics, especially on projects that I'm doing for the first time, or maybe I didn't like the way something was worded, or I write notes because if you're like me, I've made a rubric before where there's been, some component that I wish I would have included on the rubric, but then for some reason it got dropped off or whatever reason. But I think that this reflection, whether it be digital or you're keeping a journal or you just have a folder of notes, is really useful because sometimes in the moment during the year, we don't have time to go back into that file and change that. I know it sounds like that's something that would be really simple to do, but sometimes you're just not at that place. So keeping this spot where you have these documents that you have been able to make adjustments to, and again, this could be digital. A lot of us can go in and circle something if you have a stylus and you have some sort of surface that you can manipulate on your device, whatever works for you. But I think reflecting throughout the year is really good. But then, of course, at the end of the year, to kind of just sit back, take a deep breath, consider your successes, consider maybe what didn't work so well. Why did something not work well, or why did it work well, and how can I use that more effectively? Making sure that your instruction was appropriate for the success of all of your students. And if it isn't or wasn't, then what could be altered, or why is that? Again, I think that this year we need to maybe go a little bit easier on ourselves because we weren't all in a traditional situation, and I certainly felt like my online students were not having the same degree of success as my face-to-face students, despite me providing them very structured and chunked and sequential steps. Some of them just were struggling. So, what can I do in the future if we're in that situation again to get those students more engaged and more motivated? And, think about your personal goals and your professional goals. In my district, we have to set those at the beginning of the school year, and think about those periodically throughout the year, and whether or not we are meeting those or how we are meeting those, and consider how those goals may change and evolve for next year. And then, speaking of next year, planning for next year. Again, as you wrap up a school year, it's very difficult to start thinking about planning. But I think the most important thing for us to remember is that we are starting fresh. Anything that you did that was not successful, you don't have to do it again. Celebrate what went well, and let that guide you in what you're doing in the future. Make sure that you are going to the Godot website and looking at the GSE, and making sure that what you are teaching is aligned with our standards, and how you are meeting those. And I think you need to again allow yourselves a little bit of a break, but starting off a new year rejuvenated and with the understanding that, failure is all part of the process and part of trying new things, and they're not all going to be winners, is a really important part of our profession. And I think that we become better teachers when we allow ourselves not only to fail, but to recognize our failures. No one is perfect, and no one expects us to be perfect. But I think the difference is whether or not you let the failure define you, or whether or not you allow yourself to use that as a jumping off point for becoming better at what we do. I hope everyone had a great school year, and I hope that as you move forward, you are able to continue to join our webinars, and I wish you all a good summer.